This is the final lecture that prepares you for actually writing your behavior study. It's about making sense of numbers. And what I mean by that is that until now we focused on getting those numbers and doing sort of the basic numeric, statistical, quantitative analysis of the numbers. But now we have to make those numbers worth something and mean something. So that's why this is the path to victory with your behavior study. So these are my correlations, right? This is the table that you would have seen last time. I made a little bit of a change so that you could read some of the cells differently, but this is what I've done. And just to review and remind you with what it is that we're looking at, all of these things here, like if you look at, say, this box right here, that number is the relationship between attitude 4 and the relationship between attitude 1. The problem is that we don't care about that. What we're interested in is how all of these things, right, all the attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, we're interested in how all of those relate to people's behaviors. And this is overall how many, that they all or, all none, all to none of the lectures were watched, what percentage in the future they watch of the lectures in an online class, and currently what percentage of lectures have they watched. And so I asked it 3 ways. I can just look at one of them. We'll talk about that later. But we have all this stuff, this giant chart. We're going to start reducing it down and making it much more manageable. Right? So see all the ways in which the various attitudes and subjective norms and perceived behavioral control, I don't need those. So you have this giant thing and it feels very overwhelming. Just know that this stuff up here, we're not interested in it. It just ends up being there. We're just interested in knowing how do all those variables relate to behavior. So I had 3 of these on behavior. We're going to talk about that in a second. But as I look at these numbers, remember I said some numbers, like this, look at this one, 0.05. That's a teensy effect size, right? 0.1, that's actually a pretty small, effect size. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to block out anything that's not at least really close to a 0.15, right? So that's what I'm left with now, right? This is what I'm looking at. Um, it's just these numbers, right? Just those there, and so I don't even have as many as I used to have. As I said, I'd asked about future percent and current percent, and really that doesn't give me information much different, better than what I have up here for current. And so I've collected the data, but sometimes some data doesn't tell me a whole lot, and so I'm not going to deal with it. So as we're looking at the numbers, I'm going to go ahead and sort of some of that behavior stuff. The future percent and the current percent, I don't need them because the question I had about all to none, how many lectures are you watching, that gave me enough data right there. And as I said, there's 3 of these results, this one here and here and here. They don't really give me a whole lot of information because the effect size is so small. So in the end, I'm not even going to deal with it. So from this giant chart of numbers, here's what I'm left with. That's it, right? That's it. And even then, right, as you're looking at it, we have these three variables that, or not 3 variables, but 3 correlations that have such a low effect size, I don't want to talk about them. So it could be 11 numbers is really just 8. And so I'm going to put all of those in a chart to make it easy for me and for everyone else to look at. And there it is, right? So you see on this chart, it does not represent attitude 1, attitude 4, or subjective norm 4 because those all had such small correlations. And this chart, right, when I say this chart, I mean this beauty right here, right? That's the sort of thing you could certainly include in your paper, but you don't want to just throw that chart down. You want to then talk to me, the reader, or in the future, talk to an employer or a client about these numbers, right? Here's these numbers, and what do we think those numbers mean, right? And that's the really important part in the paper is you've gotten these numbers. Now, why, or what do we do with them? Why do we care about them? So let's go through just if I were writing the paper, what would I do with these results? What would I say in my paper? So I would look at the first one and I would make an observation. I'd say the desire to learn, and this was about the student's desire to learn as much as possible and whether or not listening to lectures would allow them to do that. So the desire to learn from the class has a modest effect on students' viewing of lectures, right? That's what it is. It's modest. It's because 0.3 is that sort of medium effect size. So it's a fairly modest effect, right? And so from that, I would have two suggestions. I would emphasize that if you want this, to the student, I'd say if you want to really learn something from the class, you have to watch the lectures. I would emphasize that. And I'd also emphasize that the point of going to a class or being in a class is to acquire knowledge and skills, right? Because remember, it might be that students, because that relationship just says that the extent to which people care, right, the extent to which they care about learning, and then the extent to which they think lectures will help them learn, that affects whether or not they go to look at the lectures. So then, one way to get people to do more or to be more attentive to listening and watching the lectures in a class is to emphasize you are encouraged to learn, to develop knowledge and skills. And in this class, the only way to do that is by watching the lectures, right? So I make that suggestion. For attitude 3, I'd observe this is an important factor, right? See, the effect size of it is pretty big. Getting a high grade in the class has a fairly strong effect on students' viewing of lectures, right? So the suggestions I would make there is that you should emphasize that to students that your best chance of getting a good grade is watching the lectures, and also emphasize why it is you want to try to get a good grade, right? Now, I'm just doing a sentence for each one of these. In your paper, this needs to be like a couple pages or so altogether, so you could certainly make a brief paragraph out of these, or maybe you, in a good-sized paragraph, you talk about two related variables together, right? Right. Subjective norm 1, professor's opinion has little effect on students. Suggestion is to emphasize professors' interest in student learning and well-being to improve the impact of the professor's opinion on students' behavior, right? So that's what we could do. We could let students know that the professors want you to watch these lectures and that your professor is very invested in you. Your professor wants to see you do well, and I do, right? I really am. I mean, that's a reason I push you is because I'm wanting to see you do well. I'm wanting you to develop pushing yourself to develop a new set of skills to really excel once you leave the university. That is my hope for you. It's why I'm in this job that doesn't pay terribly well for the number of years I spent in school. It's because of what I want to do for students. Okay, but as we say, it's not big, but if you want to do something with it, you can. Then we have these two, SN2 and SN3. That's a negative correlation. I don't even know what to say about that. So as the classmates feel you should be watching lectures, a person won't. As they say you shouldn't, they will. I just can't make sense of it. Some variables are anomalies, some variables are a mystery, a palaver, if you like. I don't know. So observation is a surprising negative correlation may not be able to unpack in this case. Right? Sometimes what you say is there's a negative relationship, it's not clear why, it's unexpected, right? We can't do anything with it now, right? Perhaps we need to investigate this further, why this is, what's going on here. It may be some sort of an anomaly. And truthfully, just between us friends here, there could be an issue with these numbers because with what we're doing here, just using in Excel, we're not able to do, or at least some versions of Excel, the data pack we have, we're not able to do a test for significance, which is a whole other statistical thing. And it's not a stats class. And it might tell us that maybe that relationship is in the numbers but not reliable. It's a whole thing. But anyway, so in this case, I would say those two, it's an anomaly. I'm not going to get into it. I'm just going to look at it later. It's just sort of moving on to PBC1. Remember, I said in my lectures on theory of planned behavior that PBC often has a very strong effect size. Well, this variable has a pretty strong effect size. Sorry to hear that dinging from my computer. I apologize. That this is an important factor. Whether or not a lecture is boring and students' persistence has a serious impact on the decision to watch lectures, right? And this was whether or not people see a lecture as boring, and then their determination in the face of watching the lecture, in the face of being boring or not, was a huge factor in terms of whether or not they watched the lectures. So if they were easily distracted by things that were boring or discouraged by things that were boring, they weren't going to listen to lectures. But if they had the attitude, I'm going to watch the lecture no matter what, then they definitely were going to be watching lectures if that was not going to be a deterrent, right? So the suggestions here is to say that professors should work to make online lectures as engaging as possible. I get that's talking at me. I do what I can. It's tough because you can't see me. There's not a human engagement there. It's a tough thing, right? Also, students must be encouraged to persist even if information is not entertaining, right? A campaign that would be aimed at saying something about, that sometimes it's not exciting, but the benefit of it is important, right? Something that sort of encourage them even in the face of being bored to keep on, right? This is what we'd be doing to persuade people to actually change their behavior. The the next last item there, PBC2, I'd observe that this has to do with how dense the lecture is, has a fairly moderate impact on students, right? And whether or not they're going to watch the lectures. 2 suggestions, try not to make the lectures too dense. I understand I'm working at that. I actually work to not make them dense, so I try to use a lot of examples. The material's just thick, but I try to use a lot of examples. But maybe I need to do more. And then also, students must be encouraged to persist even when information is challenging, right? Even though it's thick, do it again or go and get more help. Or but a campaign or messages aimed at students, telling them, again, sometimes the stuff is tough, but that just means that there's a greater reward to be had from it. I know something, right? But we're talking about what's the outcome here that we can use in terms of designing persuasive messages to change behavior. And then the last one, that how long a lecture is has a moderate impact on students. I made a 0.364. That's what is that? That's the third strongest correlation we have here, right? By the way, this is why I've tried to more recently even do sort of shorter lectures. My lectures in this class used to be longer. I've tried to do more and make them smaller. Maybe it's helping, maybe it's not, but I am trying. Right. So suggestions here, that professors should work to make online lectures as brief as possible, and students must be encouraged to persist even if it's long. It's a long lecture, but class lectures are long, so you gotta stick it out. You gotta pause and come back to it or something, right? But messages aimed at getting students to persist, right? Always really about persistence, because that has to do with perceived power and whether or not people feel they can do something. So we're encouraging them to persist. So I have all these, right? I go through and observe. Here's what that correlation is. Based on that, here's some general things, right? But with all this, think about, with all these, which ones are really most important to us, right? There are these 5 correlations are the ones that are the biggest and most interesting of any of them, right? Or I admit we have that SN2, but I don't even know what sense to make of that one. I just don't. But you may want to encourage that if nothing else, these 2 factors, right, Attitude 3 and PBC 1, these should be the real targets. These should be the things really focus on because they have the most, right, they have the most impact. That's the sort of thing you can talk about in your paper, right, to emphasize those things, that here's these different findings, but overall, right, the most attention should probably be put in these places, and strategies that will offer these types of messages and target these sorts of issues, right? 'Cause that's what you're doing here. You're really acting as a consultant, looking at population, then deciding what does a persuasive campaign need to do. So this is you heading to your behavior study, right? I want to encourage you. You have come this far. You have designed a survey. You've revised it once, probably twice, maybe more, I don't know. You've collected data. Do the analysis. You can go just a little further. You can do this. And really, when you submit this project, you need to reflect on how much you did and you can do. When this is done, you need to recognize you were able to design a survey based on a theory, to collect data about a population, to be able to make suggestions for how to actually change their behaviors. Not just like you randomly making up things. You're going to be making suggestions based on data of people that was collected in a systematic and logical manner. So what you're doing is a big deal. Go a little bit further and you're going to have a project you can really be proud of. Good luck to you, and as you need anything, please, please be in touch.